This is what Viking warriors did to Christian nuns. They didn't just kill them, they destroyed their souls. You've heard stories of Viking raids before, villages burning, churches looted, swords flashing in the dark. But what happened inside the quiet walls of convents? That part of history was whispered, not written. It was the kind of story priests hesitated to record. And when they did, they wrote with trembling hands. You see, for the nuns, death wasn't the worst thing that could happen. It was what came before death, or what came instead of it. Imagine this: a peaceful convent on a misty coast, the sound of bells calling to prayer. Then, the ground begins to shake. The horizon fills with dragon-headed ships. Before the sisters can finish their hymn, the raiders arrive not to steal gold, but to shatter faith. They didn't understand vows or purity. To them, a nun wasn't sacred, she was a prize. And in the eyes of the church, what they did to those women was beyond sin. It was a desecration so complete that even heaven might turn away. For centuries, Christian chroniclers described it in the only words they could find worse than death. Because for these women, dying would have been mercy. But this isn't just a story of cruelty. It's a story of belief, fear, and how two worlds, one built on faith, one on fire, collided in a storm that scarred an entire age. And when you hear what the Vikings actually did, you'll understand why even the bravest monks prayed never to see their sails again. To understand why Viking raiders went after nuns, you need to step into the world of the early Middle Ages, a time when faith ruled everything and the church was more powerful than kings. Across England, Ireland, and France, monasteries and convents were the beating heart of society. They held gold, books, relics, and in a way, the soul of Christian Europe. For Vikings, who came from a world of thunder gods and battle glory, these quiet, holy places were alien and irresistible. You see, Viking raids weren't random acts of madness. They were calculated. Ships glided across rivers and coasts straight toward isolated monasteries because that's where the wealth was and the people couldn't fight back. Nuns and monks were unarmed, sheltered by faith alone. To the Vikings, that looked like easy treasure. But it went deeper than gold. To pagans who worshipped Odin and Thor, the Christian cross represented a rival power, one that threatened their gods. Burning a church wasn't just robbery, it was rebellion. It was like saying, your God can't protect you. So when the longships came, they didn't just plunder, they desecrated. Altars became slaughter tables, holy relics were torn apart, and the women, the nuns who had devoted their lives to God, became living symbols of conquest. For the raiders, it was victory. For the nuns, it was apocalypse. And yet, through the eyes of history, there's something even darker. Because what the Vikings did next wasn't only about killing or stealing, it was about breaking souls. They turned purity into punishment and faith into fear. As one monk wrote after the sack of Lindisfarne, the church of Street Cuthbert is spattered with blood. The house of God is a house of death. You might think death in a Viking raid was the end. For many, it was the mercy. Because what came before, or what followed, was far worse. When the Vikings stormed a convent, they weren't just attacking people. They were tearing apart everything those women believed in. Imagine spending your whole life in prayer, believing your body and soul belong to God, then hearing the crash of doors, the shouts of men, the screams of your sisters. For the nuns, their vows were sacred. Chastity, obedience, faith, those were their shields. But the Vikings didn't care. To them, these vows meant nothing. And so, they broke them, brutally, publicly, deliberately. Many chronicles tell of nuns being dragged from their sanctuaries, stripped, mocked, or worse, forced into what the church called living sin. Some were taken as slaves, others as concubines or trophies for Viking chiefs. In their world, a woman's purity was everything. Losing it meant losing your soul. That's why the monks wrote again and again that what the Vikings did was worse than death. It wasn't just violence, it was spiritual destruction. Others were paraded before their own churches, humiliated while their holy spaces were defiled. Horses were stabled in sanctuaries. Altars became butcher blocks. Sacred relics, bones of saints, Pieces of the cross were smashed or stolen, their meaning trampled under boots. And when the captives were taken away, shipped across cold seas to be sold, that was a second death. To live among pagans, serving men who mocked their God, was the ultimate damnation. For a nun, it meant being trapped in sin forever, unable to confess, unable to return, cut off from heaven itself. So yes, worse than death wasn't exaggeration. It was the truth of what they felt. Death ended pain. But what the Vikings did made pain eternal. History remembers battles, kings, and empires, but sometimes the stories that truly haunt the past come from the people who never held a sword. If you lived in medieval Europe, you would have heard the name Lindisfarne whispered like a curse. It was 793 AD when the Vikings came sleek dragon ships gliding through the mist, warriors leaping onto the holy island that had stood untouched for generations. The monks there didn't even know what an army looked like. They were scholars, singers, keepers of relics, and within hours, they were corpses. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle called it a great terror, and Alcuin of York wrote that the Church of Street, Cuthbert, is spattered with the blood of priests. That was the day Europe realized its God's house was no longer safe. And it didn't stop there. The raids spread like a plague. In Ireland, monasteries were burned so often that chroniclers stopped counting. In France, the Vikings attacked places that had been considered untouchable holy ground, convents, even the outskirts of Paris. One of the most horrifying stories came from 858 AD at the convent of Streetsier near Paris. When word reached the sisters that the Viking fleet was approaching, they didn't run. They walked calmly to the river and drowned themselves. Every single one. The chronicler wrote, they chose a holy death over the defilement of their sacred bodies. It's hard to imagine that kind of fear, the kind that makes you pray for death before the enemy even arrives. But that was the power of the Vikings' reputation. They didn't just conquer, they haunted. Even a century later, people would shiver when hearing tales of women carried off to distant lands, sold in markets from Dublin to Baghdad. For the survivors, there was no coming home, only silence. And that silence is how you know heaven itself was shaken. To understand why chroniclers called it worse than death, you have to think like someone from that world. A world where faith wasn't just belief, it was your entire identity. If you were a nun, your body wasn't yours anymore. You'd given it to God. Every prayer, every breath, every moment of silence was a promise, a marriage to Christ. That's what the church called it, being a bride of God. So imagine what it meant when the Vikings came. They didn't just kill you, they broke that sacred marriage. They tore you away from the life you built with your faith. And for a woman who believed her soul was her only way to reach heaven, that was a nightmare far deeper than pain. In the Christian world, dying in God's name meant salvation. But to be violated, enslaved, or forced to serve pagan masters, that was to live in sin, cut off from grace. Many believed that if they died in that state, heaven's gates would never open. That's why some chose death before capture. They weren't giving up, they were escaping damnation. Even the monks who wrote about these events struggled to describe it. Their words weren't just history, they were trauma. The holy virgins are defiled, one chronicler wrote, and the enemies of Christ rejoice. You can almost hear the despair in his ink, a world watching its faith crumble before its eyes. The phrase worse than death wasn't meant to shock. It was meant to warn, to show that what the Vikings brought wasn't just destruction, but spiritual annihilation, a war not only for land and gold, but for souls. And that's why this story still echoes. Because deep down, it isn't only about the past. It's about what happens when belief meets brutality, and faith itself is forced to bleed. What the Vikings did to those nuns still lingers in history's silence. It wasn't just war, it was the moment faith met horror. The church rebuilt its walls, but the fear never left. For centuries, their stories were whispered in candlelight, reminders of a time when holiness offered no protection. And yet, from that terror came resilience. The church endured, the faith survived, scarred but unbroken. Because even when the world burned, those who believed still prayed. And in their prayers, the voices of the lost still echo softly, like waves against a dark shore.